The twin suns of Xyrus Prime beat down like molten coins pressed against the sky, their glare turning the endless dunes of the crimson wastes into a shimmering furnace. Dust devils twisted lazily in the distance, carrying the scent of scorched metal and old blood, the lingering perfume of war. Amidst the wreckage of a downed Zenther gunship, half buried in red sand, moved a lone figure in a grease-stained jumpsuit patched with insignias so faded they were nearly ghosts. His name was Corin Vale, and he was, by trade and temperament, a janitor. Not a soldier, not a hero, just someone who swept up after the real players had finished making messes. He carried a dented mop bucket slung over one shoulder and a plasma torch that doubled as a broom when the sand got too stubborn. His boots crunched over shattered armor plating as he whistled a tuneless hum, more habit than melody, scanning the debris field for salvageable tech or, more commonly, body parts that needed bagging before the carrion beetles arrived. Corin had been stationed at Forward Base Theta for 6 months, ever since Earth's coalition signed a fragile truce with the Dominion of Varelia. He'd expected diplomacy to mean fewer corpses. Instead, it just meant cleaner uniforms on the people making them. Today's wreckage belonged to a Dominion transport. No insignia, no black box, just a smoldering husk and a few charred skeletons fused to their seats. Standard cleanup. Routine. Unremarkable. That was, until the sand 20 yards east of the wreck exploded. A figure burst from the dune like a ghost given flesh. Tall, impossibly graceful even in panic, with skin like polished jade and hair the color of wildfire. She wore the tattered remains of a Royal Guard uniform, slashed through the chest and stained with dark, iridescent blood that shimmered like oil in sunlight. Her eyes, wide and gold-flecked like molten topaz, locked onto Corin for a heartbeat before her legs gave way. She collapsed into the sand, then dragged herself forward, fingers clawing at the earth, breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Corin froze, mop bucket slipping from his shoulder with a clang. "Oh, stars," he muttered, already moving before his brain caught up. He wasn't trained for this. He fixed leaky pipes and mopped up coolant spills, not whatever this was, but the sight of her, proud, wounded, clearly running from something terrible, jolted something deep in his chest. He dropped beside her, sand puffing around his knees. Hey, easy now," he said, voice softer than he'd used in months. "I've got you." She looked up at him, pupils dilated with fear and pain, and then her eyes rolled back. Her body went slack, and Corin caught her just before her head hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, all lean muscle and bone beneath that green skin, her orange hair spilling like liquid flame across his forearm. From this close, he could see the gash along her ribs, deep, but not immediately fatal. Good. That was good. He could work with that. Then came the sound he'd been dreading. The low, insectal whine of skimmer engines cutting through the heat haze. 3 Dominion assassins dropped from the sky like vultures, their armor sleek and black, faces hidden behind mirrored visors that reflected nothing but Corin's own stunned expression. They moved with lethal synchronicity, boots barely disturbing the sand as they formed a semicircle around him and the unconscious princess. The lead assassin raised a pulse dagger, its blade humming with enough charge to melt steel. "Hand her over, human," the voice grated through the helmet's modulator. "She is condemned by royal decree. Her death is not your concern." Corin swallowed hard. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had no weapon, no armor, just a mop bucket and a plasma torch that would take 10 seconds to ignite. 10 seconds he didn't have. But something in him refused to let go of her. Maybe it was the way her fingers had clenched his sleeve before she passed out. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in her face, even in pain. Or maybe, after years of cleaning up other people's wars, he was just tired of being invisible. "Actually," Corin said, voice surprisingly steady, "I think it is." He didn't wait for their reaction. With a grunt, he heaved the mop bucket straight into the lead assassin's chest, sending a spray of dirty water and disinfectant across the alien's visor. In the same motion, he slapped the ignition stud on his plasma torch. Blue fire roared to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the sand. The assassins hesitated just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Corin scooped the princess into his arms, surprised by how naturally she fit against his chest, and bolted toward the wrecked gunship. Pulse bolts sizzled past his ears, kicking up geysers of red sand. He dove through a shattered hatch, rolling behind a bulkhead just as a bolt cratered the metal where his head had been. The assassins wouldn't follow inside, not immediately. Wrecks were unpredictable. Power cells could detonate, hulls could collapse. They'd wait him out, circle like sharks. He laid the princess gently on the deck, her skin already cooling. "Come on, your highness," he whispered, fumbling for the medkit clipped to his belt. Standard issue, more band-aids than battlefield trauma supplies. He pressed a pressure pad to her wound, wincing at how much blood soaked through instantly. Her breath was shallow, her pulse fluttering like moth wings. "Don't you dare die on me. I just washed this jumpsuit." Outside, the skimmers circled lower. Corin knew he couldn't stay, but carrying her through open desert was suicide. Unless, his eyes darted to the cockpit. The gunship's main thrusters were gone, but the auxiliary power core was still humming, a low, steady thrum beneath the groans of buckling metal. And strapped to the co-pilot's chair, a desert skiff, the kind used for short-range scouting. Small, fast, and miraculously still intact. He hauled the princess onto his back, securing her arms around his neck with a length of emergency cord. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain across her face, but she didn't wake. "Hang tight, princess," he grunted, climbing into the skiff. The controls were Dominion standard. Thank the stars for intergalactic military conformity. He thumbed the ignition, and the engine coughed to life with a whine that made his teeth ache. Pulse fire pinged off the gunship's hull as he punched the throttle. The skiff shot out of the wreck like a startled lizard, kicking up a wall of sand that blinded their pursuers for precious seconds. Corin weaved through the dunes, using the terrain for cover, his heart in his throat. Behind him, the assassins gave chase, their skimmers faster but less agile in the rough terrain. One gained ground, its rider leaning out with a net launcher. Corin swerved hard right, the skiff tilting dangerously, and the net sailed harmlessly into a dune. He didn't know where he was going. Just away. Away from assassins, away from the war, away from the life of a nobody janitor who'd somehow ended up with a dying alien princess strapped to his back. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Beautiful, brutal, and indifferent. The twin suns dipped lower, casting long violet shadows that made the dunes look like sleeping dragons. Hours bled into one another. The princess stirred once, murmuring something in a language Corin didn't understand. Soft, melodic syllables that sounded like wind through crystal chimes. He glanced back, catching her golden eyes fluttering open. For a moment, fear flooded her expression. Then recognition. Then something else. Something softer, warmer. "You." Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You are not my guard." "Nope," Corin said, trying to keep his tone light despite the exhaustion weighing down his limbs. "Just the guy who mops up after your royal family's messes. Name's Corin." She studied him, really studied him, as if seeing past the grease stains and tired eyes to something beneath. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "I am Princess Lyra of House Varelia." She winced, clutching her side. "And you saved me." "Well," Corin said, swerving around a particularly jagged rock formation. "Technically, I'm still in the middle of that part. The not dying part comes later." Lyra let out a weak laugh that turned into a cough. Brave and funny. A rare combination in men who carry mop buckets. "Hey, don't knock the bucket. Saved my life more than once." He glanced at the horizon. The suns were nearly gone, and with them visibility. "We need shelter. Somewhere they won't look." "There's an old mining outpost," Lyra murmured, her head lolling against his shoulder. "Northwest. Abandoned since the sand plague. I used to play there as a child." Corin nodded, adjusting course. As the last light bled from the sky, he found it. A cluster of low, domed structures half buried in the dunes, their alloy walls pitted with age and sand erosion. He landed the skiff in the lee of the largest dome, killed the engine, and carefully lifted Lyra out. She was burning up now, fever setting in. Her skin felt hot even through his jumpsuit. Inside the outpost, the air was cool and still, smelling of dust and old metal. Corin laid her on a rusted cot in what might have once been a medbay, then set to work. He cleaned her wound as best he could with his meager supplies, using the last of his antiseptic gel and wrapping her ribs in pressure bandages cobbled together from his own shirt. She watched him the whole time, her golden eyes never leaving his face. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly, when he finally sat back, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. Corin shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Didn't seem right to leave you for buzzards. Besides, those assassins looked like the kind who'd make a mess I'd have to clean up later." Lyra smiled again, A real one this time. You lie poorly, Corin Vale. She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. Cool now, despite the fever. Your hands, they're steady. But your heart, it races for me. He looked up then, meeting her eyes. In the dim emergency light, her green skin glowed faintly, her orange hair a halo of fire against the dark metal wall. She was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Regal, yes, but also vulnerable. Real. Maybe, he admitted. But you're a princess. Well, you saw the bucket. A princess hunted by her own family, she corrected gently. My uncle, Lord Zavros, has declared me traitor for refusing to sign the Blood Accord, a treaty that would enslave half the desert tribes. He sent those assassins to silence me before I could reach the tribal elders. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, her gaze sharpening. But I will not be silenced, and I will not let him tear my people apart. Corin sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him like desert dust. He'd spent his whole life avoiding responsibility, staying small, staying safe. But something about Lyra, her courage, her quiet determination, made him feel small in a different way. Not insignificant, just called. Then we go to the elders, he said finally. Tomorrow, at dawn. Lyra's eyes widened. You would come with me? After all this? Well, Corin said, standing and stretching his aching back. Someone's got to carry the bucket. And honestly, princess, you look like you'd fall over if you tried to walk 5 feet. She laughed, really laughed, and the sound filled the dusty outpost like music. Outside, the twin moons rose over the dunes, casting silver light across the endless desert. Somewhere out there, assassins hunted them. Somewhere a war brewed. But here, in this forgotten place, a janitor and a princess sat in the quiet, their fates tangled like desert vines. The next morning, Lyra was stronger. The fever had broken, and though she moved stiffly, she was walking on her own. Corin scavenged the outpost for supplies, found a half-charged power cell, a rusted but functional canteen, and, miraculously, a desert cloak woven from sun-resistant fibers. He draped it over Lyra's shoulders, tucking the hood around her face to hide her distinctive hair. You look like a very fancy bandit, he said, and you look like a janitor who forgot his bucket. She shot back, but her eyes sparkled. They set out on foot, the skiff abandoned, too noisy, too traceable. The journey to the tribal elders would take 3 days across the harshest stretch of the Crimson Wastes. Corin carried most of the gear, his old muscles aching in protest, but he didn't complain. Lyra walked beside him, her steps growing surer with every mile. They talked as they walked, about Earth, about Varelia, about the strange, small things that made life worth living. She told him about the crystal gardens of her palace, how the light fractured into rainbows at dawn. He told her about riding bicycles as a kid, about the smell of rain on hot pavement. Rain? She'd asked, fascinated. Water falling from the sky? Yeah, he'd said, grinning. It's messy, kinda cold. But it makes everything smell alive. She'd looked up at the cloudless sky, wistful. I'd like to see rain someday. On the second night, they made camp in the shadow of a sand-carved monolith. Corin built a small fire, just enough to ward off the night chill, and heated a protein ration. Lyra sat close, her shoulder pressed against his. Not for warmth but for something deeper, something neither of them named. Do you ever wonder, she said quietly, what your life would be like if you hadn't found me that day? Corin poked the fire with a stick. I'd probably be scrubbing coolant off the mess hall floor right now, complaining about the coffee. She smiled. And instead, you're walking through a desert with a wanted princess, hunted by assassins, heading toward a war council you have no business attending. Sounds about right, he said. But hey, at least the view's better. She leaned her head on his shoulder then, and he didn't pull away. The desert stretched around them, vast and ancient, but in that moment, the whole universe felt small enough to hold in his hands. They reached the tribal encampment at dawn on the third day, a ring of sandstone tents nestled in a dry riverbed, guarded by warriors with eyes as sharp as their blades. Lyra stepped forward, pulling back her hood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But then an elder, a woman with skin like old leather and eyes that had seen centuries, stepped forward and knelt. Daughter of Varelia, the elder said, voice thick with emotion. We feared you lost. Lyra helped her up, her own eyes glistening. Not lost, just delayed by a very stubborn janitor. Corin shifted awkwardly under the sudden weight of dozens of curious stares. But the elder turned to him, studying him with unnerving intensity. Then, to his shock, she bowed. "You carried our princess through fire and sand," she said. "You have the heart of a desert lion. You are welcome here." Inside the council tent, Lyra spoke with fierce passion, laying out her uncle's treachery, the horrors of the blood accord, the need for unity. Corin sat quietly in the corner, but his presence was noted. This human, this outsider, who had risked everything for their princess. Afterward, as the elders debated, Lyra found him outside, watching the sunset paint the dunes in shades of amber and rose. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," she said, stepping close. "We fight, not with armies but with truth, with honor." She took his hands in hers, her touch warm and sure. "And you will stand with me." He looked down at their joined hands, then up into her golden eyes. "I don't know much about being a hero, Lyra, but I know I can't walk away from you." She smiled, and in that smile was a promise of storms to weather, battles to fight, and a future neither of them could yet imagine. Somewhere beyond the dunes, Lord Zavros plotted his final move. But here, in the heart of the desert, a janitor and a princess stood together, their hands clasped, their paths now one. And the desert, old and wise, held its breath. The tribal elders reached their decision by moonrise. They would not march to war, not yet, but they would send word to the scattered desert clans, summoning them to a gathering of sands beneath the sky-splitter mesa, a sacred site half-buried in the heart of the wastes. There, Lyra would present her case before the full council of tribal chieftains, and if the majority stood with her, they would rally behind House Varelia, not the usurper Zavros, but the true heir with fire in her hair and sand in her boots. Corin was given a place among the honor guard, not because of rank, but because Lyra insisted. "He carried me when I could not walk," she told the elders, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "He speaks little, but his hands speak truth." So Corin found himself outfitted in desert leathers stitched with sun-reflective thread, a curved blade at his hip that felt foreign but not unwelcome. He still carried his plasma torch, and, much to the amusement of the Varelian warriors, he'd refused to part with his old mop bucket. It now held emergency rations, extra bandages, and a dented canteen he'd polished until it gleamed. The journey to Skysplitter Mesa took 5 days. Along the way, Corin learned the rhythms of desert life, the way the sand whispered before a storm, how to read the flight of razor-winged lizards to find water, which glowing fungi were safe to eat. Lyra walked beside him always, her strength returning with each sunrise. At night, they sat by the fire, she speaking of her childhood, how she'd snuck out of the palace to ride sand skimmers bareback, how she'd once traded her royal circlet for a basket of star fruit from a nomad child. Corin told her about Earth's oceans, about snow, about the simple joy of a perfectly grilled cheese sandwich. They laughed often, their laughter weaving into the fabric of the desert wind. On the 4th night, just before dawn, Corin woke to the sound of distant engines. He sat bolt upright, hand on his blade. Lyra was already standing, her eyes narrowed toward the eastern horizon, where 3 black dots hovered against the fading stars. "Scouts," she whispered. "Zavros knows we're coming." The tribal warriors moved with swift silence, dousing fires, camouflaging tracks. Corin helped Lyra into a reinforced sand cloak lined with thermal dampening mesh. "Stay behind me," he murmured, though he knew she'd defy him if she had to. The skimmers circled lower, scanning. One dropped a drone, a spider-like machine that skittered across the dunes, sensors whirring. Corin didn't think. He grabbed a handful of phosphor dust from his bucket, meant for marking salvage paths, and flung it into the air. The drone's sensors flared, overloaded by the sudden burst of light, and it scuttled in confused circles before self-destructing in a puff of smoke. The skimmers banked sharply, firing blind into the dunes. Pulse bolts lit up the pre-dawn gloom, but the camp was already empty. The tribe vanished like mirages. Corin and Lyra crouched in a dry ravine, hearts pounding in unison. "They're getting bolder," Lyra said, her voice tight. "He must be desperate. Or he knows the gathering is close," Corin replied. She looked at him then, not as a protector, but as an equal. "If something happens to me, don't," he cut in, sharper than he intended. "Don't say that. I didn't drag you through half this desert just to lose you now." Her golden eyes held his for a long moment. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. Just once, featherlight. "Then don't let them take me, Corin Vale." He nodded, jaw set. I won't. They reached Skysplitter Mesa as the twin suns crested the horizon. The mesa rose like a shattered sword from the sands, its flat top wide enough to hold 1,000 souls. Already, hundreds had gathered, warriors, elders, healers, children. All tribes of the Crimson Wastes, their banners fluttering in the hot wind. Lyra walked among them, not as a princess demanding obedience, but as one of them, greeting old friends, touching foreheads in the desert custom of respect. Corrin stayed at the edge of the crowd, feeling out of place despite his new leathers. But Lyra kept glancing back, her gaze anchoring him. When the council horn sounded, a deep, resonant note carved from the bone of an ancient sand leviathan, she took her place on the stone dais at the mesa's center. She spoke for hours. She laid bare Zavros's lies. The forged documents, the bribed generals, the secret prisons where dissenters vanished. She spoke of peace without subjugation, of alliance without chains. Her voice never rose in anger. It deepened in sorrow, in hope, in quiet, unshakable resolve. Then Zavros struck, not with words but with fire. From the sky, a dozen Dominion gunships descended, their hulls painted with his personal sigil. A serpent coiled around a broken crown. Pulse cannons roared, turning the mesa's edges into molten slag. Screams erupted as warriors scrambled for cover. It wasn't an army he'd sent, it was an execution squad. He didn't want debate. He wanted Lyra dead before she could unite the tribes. Corrin! Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. He was already moving, shoving civilians toward the mesa's natural tunnels, old mining shafts that wound deep into the rock. This way! Go, go! He shouted, his voice hoarse with command he didn't know he possessed. Above, Zavros himself stepped onto the lead gunship's ramp, tall and gaunt, his green skin sallow with age, his eyes cold as vacuum. Niece, he called, voice amplified by a command modulator. Your rebellion ends here. Surrender, and I'll let your pet human live. Lyra stood her ground, but her hand found Corrin's as he reached her side. Never, she shouted back. Zavros sighed, as if disappointed by a child's tantrum. Then burn with your dreams. The gunships opened fire in earnest. Corrin yanked Lyra behind a stone outcrop as molten rock sprayed the dais. He scanned the chaos. Warriors returning fire with outdated rifles, elders shielding children. The sky choked with smoke. There's a secondary power coupling on those gunships, he said suddenly, his janitor's mind clicking into overdrive. Just behind the engine nacelle. One precise shot, and the whole thing overloads. Lyra stared at him. You can hit it from here? No, he said, already stripping off his outer tunic, revealing a compact pulse rifle he'd scavenged days ago but kept hidden. But I know someone who can. He turned to Kira, the tribe's youngest sharpshooter. A girl no older than 16, with eyes like flint and hands steady as stone. Kira, the engines. Aim for the red housing behind the thrusters. She nodded, already sighting down her long-barreled rifle. The first shot sparked harmlessly off armor. The second pinged near the coupling. The third, Corrin held his breath, struck true. The lead gunship shuddered, then exploded in a fireball that lit the desert white-hot. Debris rained down, and the remaining ships scattered, disoriented. Zavros snarled over the comms. Kill them all! Assassins repelled from the surviving ships. Dozens of them, clad in the same black armor Corrin remembered from that first day. They moved like shadows, cutting down anyone in their path. Lyra drew twin energy blades from hidden sheaths in her boots. Their hum cutting through the din. Stay close, she said to Corrin. He grinned, hefting his rifle. Wouldn't dream of leaving. What followed was a blur of motion and mayhem. Corrin wasn't a warrior, but he'd spent years navigating tight spaces, dodging hazards, thinking 3 steps ahead. He used the terrain, rolling behind boulders, using smoke to mask movements, once even kicking a loose rock into an assassin's path to trip him long enough for Kira to take the shot. Lyra fought like a storm given form, graceful, relentless, her blades weaving patterns of light and death. But she was still healing, and fatigue crept into her movements. Corrin saw it, the slight hitch in her step, the way her left arm slowed after blocking a heavy strike. Fall back, he yelled, tossing her a smoke pellet from his bucket. She caught it without looking, threw it at their feet. Thick violet smoke billowed, and they vanished into the tunnels. Inside the mesa, the air was cool and echoing. Lyra leaned against the wall, breathing hard. One hand pressed to her side where blood seeped through the bandages again. You're hurt, Corin said, already tearing open a fresh medpack. It's nothing, she insisted. It's not nothing, he shot back, his voice sharp with worry. You're bleeding. Again. She looked up at him, her golden eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something softer. Awe, maybe. You keep saving me, she whispered. I keep trying, he said, pressing a coagulant patch to her wound. His hands were gentle despite their tremor. You're kind of terrible at staying safe. A weak laugh escaped her. And you're terrible at following orders. Occupational hazard, he muttered, securing the bandage. Janitors aren't known for obedience. She caught his wrist as he pulled away. Corin, if we survive this, will you stay? He stilled. Stay. With me. Not as a servant. Not as a guard. Her voice dropped, barely audible over the distant booms above. As more. He looked into her eyes, into the heart of the fire that had drawn him from his quiet life of buckets and brooms into this maelstrom of war and wonder. He thought of rain on earth, of desert sunsets, of her laughter in the dark. I'm already staying, he said simply. Before she could reply, the tunnel entrance exploded inward. Zavros stood there, flanked by his elite guard, his face twisted with fury. Sentimentality, he spat. The weakness that will destroy our house. Lyra pushed herself upright, blades humming back to life. Corin stepped in front of her, rifle raised, though he knew it was useless against Zavros's personal shield. Run, Corin, Lyra said, her voice fierce. I'll hold them. Not happening, he said. Zavros laughed. A dry, rattling sound. How quaint. The mop boy fancies himself a knight. Then the ground shook. Not from an explosion, from movement. From the mesa itself. A rumbling grew beneath their feet, deep and ancient. The walls groaned. Dust rained from the ceiling. What? Zavros began. Then the tribe's elder appeared at the far end of the tunnel, staff raised high. The mesa remembers, she intoned. It awakens for its children. With a deafening crack, the tunnel split open. Not collapsing, but rearranging. Stone flowed like liquid, sealing Zavros and his guards behind a wall of solid rock. The rumbling subsided as quickly as it began, leaving an eerie silence. Lyra stared, awestruck. The legends, they're true. The skysplitter is alive. The elder approached, her eyes gleaming. The desert chooses its champions. It has chosen you, Lyra. And you're human. Above, the sounds of battle ceased. When they emerged onto the mesa, the gunships were gone, retreating into the distance. The tribe stood victorious, but weary. And at the edge of the crowd, hundreds more were arriving. Clans from the far dunes, drawn by the explosion, by the call of the gathering. Lyra stepped forward, bloodied but unbowed. The fight isn't over, she called, her voice ringing across the sands. But today we stand united. Today, the desert speaks with one voice. A roar went up, thousands of voices shouting her name. And in the midst of it, Corin stood beside her, no longer a janitor, no longer invisible. He was Corin Vale, who carried a bucket and a torch and a heart too big for his old life. And he was hers. Later, as stars pricked the violet sky, they walked the mesa's edge alone. The air smelled of ozone and victory. He'll come back, Lyra said quietly. Zavros won't stop. I know, Corin said. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. But next time we'll be ready. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you ever miss Earth? Sometimes, he admitted. But I think I found something worth staying for. She looked up at him, her golden eyes reflecting the starlight. What's that? He smiled, brushing a strand of orange hair from her face. You. And in the silence that followed, filled only by the whisper of the desert wind, they both knew. This was only the beginning. The war for Varelia's soul had just ignited. But they would face it together, janitor and princess, human and alien. Two souls who found each other in the ruins of a battlefield and dared to dream of peace. Somewhere beyond the dunes, a storm gathered. But here, hand in hand, they stood unafraid. The war did not end in a single battle, nor in grand declarations alone. It unfolded like the slow blooming of desert night flowers. Quietly at first, then all at once, in a riot of color and life. With the tribes united behind her, Lyra began the long work of reclaiming her people's future. Zavros still held the capital, still commanded legions loyal to his name, but the heart of Varelia. The desert, the clans, the ancient spirit of resilience, now beat for Lyra. Corin never wore a crown, never sat on a throne, and never once called himself a hero. But he was there, in the war councils, where his practical mind turned supply shortages into clever workarounds. In the field hospitals, where his steady hands stitched wounds alongside alien medics. And always at Lyra's side, not as a shadow, but as her equal. He learned Varelian customs, mastered the rhythm of their language, and even, after much teasing, stopped flinching every time someone mentioned his mop bucket. He kept it, polished and mounted on the wall of their shared quarters, as a reminder of where he'd started. Months passed. The capital fell not to siege, but to betrayal. Zavros's own generals, swayed by Lyra's mercy and Corin's quiet integrity, turned against him during the Feast of Twin Moons. Zavros was captured trying to flee aboard a smuggler's skiff, his arrogance his final undoing. He was tried not by fire, but by law, and exiled to the ice wastes of Varelia's northern pole, a fate he considered worse than death. Lyra spared his life, because peace, she told Corin that night, must begin with forgiveness, even when it aches. With Zavros gone, the Dominion fractured, then reformed. Under Lyra's rule, treaties were rewritten with fairness, not force. The desert tribes gained representation in the Royal Council. Trade routes reopened, not as channels of conquest, but of exchange. And Earth's coalition, impressed by the stability Lyra and her unlikely consort had forged, upgraded diplomatic ties to full alliance status. It was during the signing of that final treaty, a grand ceremony in the Sunspire Palace, its crystal towers catching the light of both suns, that Lyra did something no Varelian monarch had done in 500 years. She turned to Corin before the assembled dignitaries, took both his hands in hers, and knelt. The crowd gasped. Even the stoic Earth ambassador dropped his datapad. "Corin Vale," Lyra said, her voice clear and strong. "You found me broken in the sand. You carried me when I could not walk. You stood when everyone expected you to flee. You gave me not just your courage, but your kindness, the rarest treasure in any world." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Will you marry me? Not as my subject, but as my partner, as my husband, as the father of our future." Corin, who had faced assassins and warlords without blinking, felt his throat tighten. He pulled her to her feet, ignoring protocol, ignoring the 1,000 eyes upon them. "Only," he whispered, "if you promise to let me install better plumbing in this palace. The showers here are terrible." Laughter rippled through the hall. Relieved, joyous, human and alien alike. Lyra laughed too, the sound bright as chimes, and kissed him right there on the dais. They were married a month later in the ruins of the Sky-Splitter Mesa, beneath the open sky where their journey had truly begun. Kira served as Lyra's handmaiden. The tribal elder presided, and Corin wore desert leathers, not royal silks, with a single orange blossom, grown in the palace gardens from seeds Lyra had carried since childhood, tucked behind his ear. The years that followed were not without challenges. Rebuilding takes time. Old wounds heal slowly. But every evening, without fail, Corin and Lyra walked the palace gardens together, hand in hand, watching the twin suns set over the dunes.